There's a lot of data out there, as you all know, and making that data make sense for your companies can be somewhat of a challenge when there's a little bit of a disconnect in where it's coming from. The biggest gaps in the world of alcohol data have always been trying to get an accurate assessment of trends in the independent channel. There's widely known market research firms that have been able to accurately track large volumes of beer passing through the grocery channel, the convenience channel, chain retailers, and tapping into the independent channel has been a little bit more difficult. There are upwards of 50,000 off-premise independent retail accounts across the country, and that is the market that 3x3 Insights is after, those 50,000 independent retailers. They're a startup retail analytics company that launched earlier this year, and their plan is to add some objectivity to the market data that is already available by working directly with smaller independent retailers who supply transaction-level data from their point-of-sale systems. So here today to share the latest insights from the independent world is Mike Provance, the CEO of 3x3 Insights. And over the next half hour, he's going to deliver some retail insights collected from hundreds of independent retailers to help give you a better sense of what's going on at the local level. So please welcome to the stage Mike Provance. Cheers.
There's nothing like talking about and sharing data in the late afternoon, particularly after the sexiness of a pitch competition and entrepreneur stories, to induce a collective coma. So please stick with me a little bit here. I hope there will be at least some tidbits you can draw from what we're talking about. As Chris said, I'm Mike Provance, the CEO of 3x3 Insights. We got into this business earlier this year based off a mission that brought together technology and people from the retail industry, the independent retail industry, who've been at it for generations, and recognizing that something was missing. And that something was the data that was available didn't look at the retail business from the consumer's point of view. And when you talk about independent package stores, it's very hard for anyone in the industry to get a good view of what's going on there unless you can look at both what's coming downstream in the product and what's coming from the consumer's point of view, meaning what baskets are leaving the store, what's going in the trunks, what's going home. And there are companies that are doing some of this through a variety of different mechanisms, but we chose a path that took us straight into the heart of the independent retailer and looked at the problem from the 3 feet away from the shelf when the consumer's making the decision. And our starting point for that was understanding what products are moving together in the baskets. By collecting this data, we're able to work with the brands and the retailers to deliver the right product to the right consumer through the right experience. And that's really the goal that we strive to accomplish. To give you a feel for what we're talking about today, we went from 0 to 20 states to 460 stores in our network, where we're delivering almost $500 million of new transactions each year into that network and growing from 460 to over 1,000 next year. When you look at this geographically, we've been very strategic in how we approached collecting these data. We focus on local markets. So rather than just accumulating lots and lots of point-of-sale data, we instead chose to focus on Greater Boston, Greater New York City, Chicago, Indiana, Colorado, the markets where the independent retailer is densest and where the information about what's happening in those stores is darkest. And the goal was to model those markets so that we could build sample sets of those networks so that, to Chris's point, if there's 50,000 retailers in the country, we're not collecting 50,000 stores worth of data. We're finding the statistical models that let us best reflect what's going on in Boston, what's going on in New York, what's going on in Chicago, Colorado, so that as producers, as brands, you want to go into these local markets and attack them, you have the mechanism to know right away whether your campaigns are working, whether your promotions are working, whether a new product launch is successful, because we're collecting that data daily. And so instead of waiting 45, 60 days or 30 days, you can turn around a few days later and know whether something worked or not. To give you a feel for the data I want to talk with you about today, we looked at roughly 3,000 brands, of which about a third are craft brands in our network, and sampled from 116 stores that gave us enough history to look and to give you some of the year-over-year insights that I'm hoping to share today. One of the most interesting things to me to start this off is to look at the fact that year-over-year from 2017 to 2018, we saw a slight slowdown in beer sales. But craft beers tracked the mainstream beers fairly well, with one glaring exception. Something happens in the summertime that doesn't let the craft beers share in the same lift that the mainstream beers see. And so while the rest of the year you're tracking really well, the mainstream beers get the disproportionate benefit of the summertime demand for beer, which is its highest point throughout the year. When you look geographically at this, at our network, despite having strong sales of beer in New York City, the share of craft there is really low by comparison to Boston, Colorado, and some of our smaller markets like Tennessee. So there's clearly differences in consumer demand, which we all know. But what gets interesting is when you think about a New York City market and a Boston market, you're talking about largely a walking consumer market with some people driving around. And you'll see in some of the data I'm going to show you that it's reflected in the demand, that the smaller packaging leads to much higher success. But there's some unusual variations from that idea. So let me share something here with you first. And what I want to talk today with you about is a couple things. Product dynamics in these independent retailers, and then looking at pricing. Because these two things give you a feeling for what's happening in the independent sector, and then I hope to share some ideas about where you can look for opportunities in the sector as well. So these two charts measure brand churn. Simply defined, we took the top 25 brands in craft and in non-craft each and looked at what percentage of those brands turned over from one year to the next to give you a feel for the fickleness of the consumer in the independent sector. And I wanted to look here first because a lot of the sentiment that we hear in talking to the retailers and our perspective on the industry, which may or may not coincide with yours, is that the customers are very fickle about brands, and then one week they'll try one, and then they'll switch to another and to another. And yet when you look at this, in the 12 packs, you kind of see that growth, right? So green here is the craft beers, black is the non-craft. They're both climbing in churn, which means each year people are getting more fickle. And craft beer, they're much more fickle. When I look at this in 6-packs, though, there's an interesting change. It's about 5 points less. It goes from 25% churn down to 20% churn, and it's roughly equivalent to what's happening in the mainstream brands. So a lot of the fickleness may be very packaging specific rather than brand specific. And if those retailers aren't carrying the right size packages with the brands that are stable in the 6-packs, then they're likely to see more churn. And as we get into the data, we start to see some nuances about packaging, pricing, and brand that all have to fit together just right at a local level. And we see some big differences when we look from one locale to the next. This gives you a picture of performance now within the craft segment itself. And so in this segment, what you're looking at is year over year, gray being 2016 all the way to orange being 2018, of Boston, Colorado, New York City. And let me tell you, just for comparison purposes, in our sample, Colorado is really mostly Denver with a smattering of Fort Collins and Colorado Springs. So we're still talking about relatively urban populations or larger populations within Denver. There's some mountain areas that get sampled into that as well. But you can see that this is where the walking consumer comes in, right? Very little 15 packs moving in New York and Boston because nobody wants to carry those down the street on a hot day. But interestingly, you also see that the larger pack sizes in all markets tend to perform less well in the craft segment. But you're also seeing a bit of a lift in the Colorado market. When we look at this by price, it gets even more defining. Boston has a very strong $13 to $16 price point for its 12 packs. Very, very strong. When you look at New York by comparison, which is a very similar market profile, if you will, you see a much wider spread of price point success. right? And in other words, your consumers there are more diverse in terms of their segmentation. Colorado is interesting, and it's going to become more interesting with the next slide. It's very strong in the middle, $13 to $20. When I jump, though, down to 4-packs, I go from a Colorado consumer that is a kind of edging toward premium product to being on the very low end of pricing in 4-packs. And so we're starting to see within the craft segment in these retailers, 2 distinct customer segments popping out, which suggests different strategies for reaching out to those consumers. By contrast, Boston has suddenly shifted up, and now you've got 4-packs competing in the same price point for 12-packs, which suggests maybe a more price-conscious consumer, that they're coming in the door in these retailers. And remember, in the East Coast at least, the package retailers only sell alcohol. Yeah, maybe they sell some beef jerky and some other stuff, but by and large, you're going to that store to buy alcohol. And typically, they're coming in with a price in mind. And so what we're seeing here is not competition of packaging, but competition of, I came to buy a price, and maybe I'm looking at what's the best opportunity I can get for my $13. Understanding the price point at that kind of at that aggregated level is useful for seeing trends. What I want to talk about now has a lot more to do with the lessons that we've seen working with retailers and how we advise them on managing their business. And this applies both to the brands and the retailers. There's 2 areas that we focus on: price point analysis, which I'll talk about here, and then the last thing I'll talk about is the basket analysis, because these 2 things actually create opportunities for the craft industry. And why I say that is when you look at this graph, and what you're looking at here is a lot of data again. This is actually the log of total dollar sales across all the stores. And the reason I did that is because what I want you to see in here is the pricing, the competitive advantage of pricing that the craft brewers have. When you look at the graph for 4-packs, the bottom half, from about $8 and down, is dominated by mainstream, right? They sell more than the craft brewers do at those price points. But everything north of 8, the competitive power of pricing shifts to the craft brewers. Right? So people coming in to shop at that price point and above aren't coming in for mainstream products. Now, they may have opportunities, those may be options on the shelf for them, and oftentimes in these independent retailers, because of the deals they've cut with the distributors or the offers that they've been brought, they're actually over-indexed on the amount of mainstream beer they have on the shelves. Right? And so while you might have opportunity at these higher price points, you also have to fight for shelf space. And when you're talking about Boston and New York and Denver stores, there are some larger ones, but most of them tend to have small footprints, and therefore they have to make strategic choices about which products to put on those shelves. So arming yourself with evidence about how your products outperform at certain price points can be a great tool in debating on and negotiating with the distributors and how you're going to position product with them. The other piece of price point analysis, you'll see 2 large gaps there at $19 and $21 and one that's at $6. One of the best practices that we work with the retailers on, because they're constantly fighting a battle against online sales and the increasing dominance of big box and Total Wines and companies like that, is to make sure they have covered every price point possible with at least a small set of product. Because again, go back to what I said, the shoppers at package stores come in with a price point in mind. They may come in and have a brand in mind, but more often than not, what we see is they're coming in because they want to spend $15, whether it's on wine or beer or liquor. They're coming in to spend a certain amount of money. And it does vary by demographics, and it does, that best practice is impacted by other variables. But by and large, if a store has the price points covered, it's more likely to keep customers in there and keep them coming back rather than lose them to going down the street to another package store or to a big box store. So being able to fill in those gaps and see where there's price point gaps can help you position new product offerings in a way that you have less competition because of that mindset of the consumer. What's interesting is when you go from 4-packs, where there's a clear craft dominance, When I go to 6 and 12 packs, it starts to get a lot more competitive parity, meaning the mainstream brands are competing at least or almost as well as the craft brands are at higher price points. It's a much more crowded market with this larger and the higher count packaging for you guys. It's not nearly as clear cut as it is in the small packaging. You do still see some gaps and some opportunities, but those opportunities are pretty high-priced products, so you have to be coming into the market with premium or ultra-premium products. But if you can find the right balance of packaging size and pricing, you can start to make a dent on the independent segment of your revenue by catering to what the retailers need most, which is the ability to fill out their product lines and to position them best for the consumers coming in at those levels. The last piece I want to leave you with really deals with where you can shine. And this is in what's in the basket. What do I mean by what's in the basket? We look at every product that's in the bag when it's leaving the store, and we build customer profiles and we build buying patterns from those baskets. This is common practice in other CPG, but this industry hasn't done as much with basket adjacencies as it could be. And I think it's really powerful for you guys for one really big reason. When you look at the graph on the top, you've seen a lot of lift on craft products in terms of basket size. That's measuring the average basket spend, meaning a craft beer buyer is buying a bigger bag of products. And guess what the most important thing to these independent retailers is when they're trying to compete with Amazon in total? It's getting incremental lift in the basket size, especially if they can get more premium products because they're typically getting better margins there. So if they can get that increased lift, it's pretty powerful. You'll note that the mainstream market has somewhat caught up in that on average. But go back to high school or college statistics and remember you don't just look at average, right? You need to know how wide the spread is. Well, that's what the bottom shows you. And this is where it gets really interesting because when you look at the bottom, most of the craft products that are being sold are mapping basically in the center to the right, and they're spreading out. And so what this tells you across the top is what's the price point of the product, and then what's the brand, or what's the average basket spend across the x-axis. So this means that at any price point, craft beers are pulling better on average basket spend. It's only along that kind of center line where you see the competition for mainstream, with a few exceptions. And so there's a lot of power in understanding how price point ties to what's going in the basket with your product to be able to position yourself best in this independent segment. And I think that's pretty powerful when you look at kind of what the data tell us, which I've tried to summarize here, is that at a very, very top level, you're keeping up with mainstream sales on the craft side. It's just as competitive. It's moving just as well through the independent channel, except in the summertime. And I don't have an answer to why that is, because a lot of the different versions of the product and a lot of the variants seem to be summer-oriented products at times. But we're still not seeing the lift in the independent stores. My guess, if I had to do it and dig into this, you see the Budweisers and the Millers and Coors pushing a lot of discounting deals where you aren't in a position to do that as well. And therefore, there's a lot of product being moved into the market at discounted prices, which, as we saw, can be a competitive threat. Churn is a problem, but it only gets really bad on the high end of your product packaging. And so at least for the independent channel, smaller packages move better, and you see more stability in your brand once you get established. So you're less likely to get churned through by your customers. Price sensitivity here is, I tried to touch on a few points, but the main takeaway there is you have to think about price at a local level in whatever market you're going into. And I don't mean your retail price. I mean the combination of retail and discounts that you do, whatever that net price is as it's leaving the store, is a very specific positioning within each market. And you have to be thoughtful about how different markets perform with craft products in the independent segment at least. And then, finally, I think the big summary here is focus on basket value. You're not typically in the independent channel. They're not coming just to buy a 6-pack of beer or a 4-pack of beer. They're going to take 2 or 3 things with them, maybe 6 things. And you need to understand what those 2, 3, or 6 things are so that you can develop a strategy for those stores in a way that leverages all that. To give you an example, when we work with some of our retailers, we'll show them data about the baskets, and then in the store they'll repackage and they'll put a Tito's right next to a Barefoot wine because those two products travel well together. The same kind of thing happens with beer. If you know what's moving well together, you can work with your retailers on merchandising that encourages those purchases because you can get the lift. Anyway, so that's really all I had today to share some basic data with you. I want to share this bit.ly at the bottom here because the tool we use to produce all those graphs, we want to make available to you guys for several days because I did a lot of summarizing of it, but you can drill in and look at different states in our market. You can look at different filters and do some control. So if you know someone or you have your own experience with Power BI or tools like that, go in and play with it. See what you can learn. I'm Mike Provance from 3x3 Insights.
Thank you. Here. And you guys will get this sent to you afterwards, so you don't have to write it down, but we'll make sure you guys have access to that. Some really interesting stuff, and clearly, there's a lot of things to kind of pull out of the independent channel. We only got a few minutes for questions, but I mean, you mentioned it sort of in your summary there. The biggest thing that stuck out to me is like what's happening in the summertime, and why are craft brewers not able to capitalize on that opportunity that seems to be missed. So, if you were a craft brewer and you're looking at this data, what are you thinking about? How are you cutting into macro beers' share or non-craft beers' share of the summertime?
Yeah, I mean, this is really where the inefficiencies of the industry pop up, right? It's those distributors carry a lot of weight with the retailers, especially in heavily independent states. They have a lot to say about which products move and what the price points are. Honestly, it's building a rapport with the right retailers that serve the market that your product is geared for, right? It's understanding that if you have a product that's really geared to a suburban market, that you understand what the retailers in those areas are selling well into. If you're in a downtown Boston, if you're in the middle of New York City, understanding what those consumers are going to want so that they can be more selective about the product. Maybe you can't compete overall on price, but if you can identify slivers of opportunity, you can create incremental lift against that wave of discounting.
So it's less product focused and more on the execution side, so developing a pricing strategy that's more tailored?
Price, package, it's in right consumer segment, right? It's the right product to the right consumer through the right experience. It's matching to the stores that are likely to merchandise your product and not necessarily be as swayed by discounts, right? Because you can go in a number of package stores in the summer day and you're going to see stacks of cases of Corona, right? Which is great because a lot of people drink Corona. But if you've got the retailers that maybe have a small footprint and can't do that, they can't compete for those big discounts, then they need good product offerings that they can get out to their market. And so the small footprint stores may be a good summertime competitive advantage when the big stores are basically loading up on discounted product.
Just a question on kind of where you guys are headed as a company. What are sort of your plans for growth and tapping into more of these independent retailers, and what will that do to the data once you are able to tap into them?
So our vision, as I said, is understanding the human brain at that 3 feet to the shelf. And for us to do that, we started with understanding what they're walking out the door with. But ultimately, it's about having other sources of data that let us, in my ideal world of, the ideal picture that we can deliver results for is what products did they stop, pick up, and put back on the shelf before they settled on the ones that they brought to the counter. Getting into the buying brain at that level is really the long-term vision of what we're doing. There's a lot of steps to get there. But we want to understand this independent segment, first off-premise, but then what's the relationship between off and on. I think the panelist earlier spoke about the importance of establishing the brand on-premise because it gets baked in when they come off-premise.
Yeah.
we're working on ways that we can create those bridges and measure, more importantly, measure the bridges, because if you can't measure it, you can't manage it.
I'm a little bit terrified if you know what I pick up and put down before I buy something, but that is an incredible vision of trying to understand, the thought process of, hey, they grabbed a 4-pack and they set it down and they actually went for a 6-pack. How would you accomplish that?
I swear I didn't dream this, and I read something about this, but I did read about a piece of technology that was a small drone that basically hovers in the store, and they were using it to track kind of outages on the shelves. But if you can track outages on the shelves, you can also kind of observe people and what they pick up and put down. And so I'm a technologist at heart. I believe there's technology that we can use for good to be able to help the entire industry improve its efficiency and get rid of a lot of the inefficiencies, and it starts with understanding the consumer behavior.
All right, so get ready for drones to follow you around the independent liquor store. All right,
Thank you,
Mike.
Appreciate it.
Cheers.